The sirens arrived before the crowd. Did first a distant whine sliding under the iron gates, then a chorus swelling across the paved avenue until sound itself seemed to glitter off glass and chrome. By the time the vans screeched to a stop, there were phones in the air, gardeners pretending to trim hedges that didn't need trimming, drivers stepping out of idling cars, a pair of housekeepers frozen behind the foyer's curtain. The gates swung open because someone forgot to keep them closed, or because authority doesn't negotiate with iron. Officers poured through the gap in blue and gray, boots clicking, voices crisp, cameras following the uniforms like shadows. Adua was halfway down the front steps in sunglasses and a silky robe when they formed a line that cut her driveway in two. And read out the first section, charges, names, dates, statute numbers that sounded like teeth snapping shut. She laughed at first, this brittle little trill that never belonged to her, but had been lent to her by money, and reached for a manager's name, stuck to the inside of her tongue like a vitamin. The senior officer stepped forward. "Ma'am, keep your hands where we can see them." Cool, precise, sharp. A microphone swung toward the officer like a sunflower bending to the sun. Employees lined the veranda. The neighbors filmed. A reporter murmured into a camera with that low, funereal tone reserved for fallen ministers and broken bridges. The senior officer's badge caught the morning and flashed a point of light into Adesua's eyes. "Madam, we're here for your son. And for you." "What is this?" Adesua managed, lips barely moving. "What nonsense is this?" "It's not nonsense, madam. It's an arrest. Attempted bribery of an officer of the law. Obstruction. We have recordings." The words were spoken the way a surgeon announces, "Scalpel." Adesua turned her face to the crowd and saw what she could never unsee. Eyes that had once softened at her, approach now sharpening with the interest people reserve for other people's disasters. She drew herself up taller, tugged at the silk tie of her robe, and tried to summon a room she could dominate. The steps were not such a room. The driveway was not such a room. The world had become hallway and echo, and the law was a door that opened only one way. "Where is Zeno?" she asked, finding a name that was not a manager's. "Inside," an officer replied, being read his rights. "You can't do this here," she said, knowing instantly how absurd it sounded. "Take this inside. We can talk. That's the problem." The senior officer said softly enough that only those nearest heard, and turned her wrist to show a small recorder in her palm. "You've been talking for months." The handcuffs were cool and not heavy at all, like the first cold raindrops that warn of a storm. They clicked, and the cameras came closer as if metal had given them permission. Later, in a room that smelled faintly of lemon polish and fear, a door opened and a woman in a pressed uniform stepped in, and Adesua's mouth opened before she could stop it. She knew that face. Years had bent it into a stronger version of itself. But she knew how those eyes had once widened at small cruelties, and then narrowed again at the cost of personal safety. "Good morning," the woman said. "Do you remember me, ma'am?" The name was there at the rim of memory like a glass left too close to an edge. It tipped and fell and broke into 100 pieces. "Naomi," Adesua whispered. "Yes." The officer sat, folded one leg over the other as if this were a polite social call, and pressed a button on a device that glowed red. "Inspector Naomi Okafor, we'll begin now." But before the beginning, there had been a long, glittering middle. It had started, perhaps, with a cradle that could have rocked itself. Zeno arrived in a world that took his arrival as a command. Gifts came wrapped not only in ribbon but in promises. Security guards started work before he could crawl. Drivers learned routes to schools before he could spell. Glass cabinets gleamed with shoes so tiny they looked like toys, and the nursery lampshades shimmered with embroidered clouds that glowed when the lights went off, as if a false sky were better than no sky at all. The house taught him early what mattered: doors that opened when you approached, faces that rearranged themselves into smiles when you frowned, a mother who moved like a decision through every room. Adesua was the kind of woman around whom other people's plans became flexible. She did not need to announce what she wanted. The air seemed to bring it to her like a tray. The first time Zeno learned that rules bent when money pushed, he was 10 and bored. The principal had praised another boy's essay and didn't notice Zeno's scowl. 10 minutes later, a stone flew. A window sang a bright, shocking note as it shattered, and the classroom sucked in a collective breath. Zeno's face was already arranged into innocence when the teacher said his name. He didn't bother to deny it. Denial was for people who needed to win arguments. Zeno only needed to wait. He didn't wait long. Tires bit into gravel outside the school. An engine cut off mid-growl, and a Adua was a shape in the doorway, sunglasses lowering like a curtain. The principal started a sentence about safety, civility, consequences. She lifted a hand and detached each word from the sentence, as if taking beads from a thread. "My son was provoked," she said calmly, "by a system that tries to humiliate him for the smallest things. Fix the window. Send the invoice. Don't try to parent him. That's my role." "Madam, with respect," the principal said. And there was so much respect in the words, they sounded like resignation. "Children need boundaries. He is unhappy when he doesn't get his way. He's beginning to frighten the others." "Frightening?" she repeated, and her laugh cut clean through the headmaster's office, like a ribbon through air. "He's a child. Perhaps you're frightened of the work it takes to handle a child who won't beg for approval." On the way home, she tapped on her phone and approved a transfer to the school's building fund. The window was replaced before the end of the day. Zeno learned nothing from that, except that life could be rearranged by fingers, moving quickly on glass. Naomi arrived when Zeno was 11, sent by an agency that liked the way she spoke to children, neither as equals, nor as subjects, but as people with souls that could be dented by careless hands. She was quiet in the way you notice only when quietness leaves a room and the pitch rises. She oversaw homework, moved pencils back into their cups, buttoned shirts with patient fingers. For a while, the house breathed a little slower. Zeno noticed. He liked the way she didn't flinch when he rolled his eyes, the way she didn't scramble to fill his silence. He did not like the way she told him no, like a full stop and not like a comma that could be bargained into a semicolon. He tested her with small rebellions. She didn't blur. He escalated. The afternoon he reached for her and grabbed what he thought would make her gasp. It was the first time in his life that a hand connected with his cheek before money could push it away. Naomi's palm was a line of fire. He stood there, stunned, hand on face, and felt something new. Not pain, not exactly. A boundary lay on the floor between them, like a rope someone had thrown down, and he couldn't step over it without stepping on who she was. Her voice arrived after a heartbeat. "Don't ever touch me again," she said, as if the world were very simple and needed to be described in a few words. The words were not angry. They were strong. The wail he produced next was the kind that summons queens. Adua was at the door, then inside it, then filling the room with perfume and presence. "What happened?" she asked. And it wasn't a question about truth. It was a question about how to arrange the next 5 minutes. Naomi told the truth. Zeno waited to see if the truth could survive in this house. Adua stared at Naomi as if she had knocked on a door that was never meant for her. "You hit him," she said, each word wiped clean. "You hit my child." "He touched me," Naomi replied with dignity. "I told him to stop." "He didn't. He needed to learn immediately." Adesua's hand rose and fell, and for a fraction of a second Naomi was 11 again, hiding in a kitchen from an aunt's temper. But she didn't step back. She took the slap, straightened, and met Adesua's eyes. The two women stood there like two versions of a story, deciding which one would be told. "If you ever touch him again," Adesua said softly, and soft made it worse, "you won't work again. Not in this city, not in any place where my voice carries." Naomi lasted 8 months after that, long enough to start looking into evening classes at a policing college, long enough to learn that boundaries in certain houses were like chalk lines in rain. She left with a quiet goodbye to the kitchen staff, and a look at Zeno that he felt like a mirror, briefly held up to his face. More nannies came. Some were flirted with, some were bought, Some left with their dignity in both hands, and some left a little of it behind. Zeno grew. He learned to make faces into keys. If doors did not open, he learned to lean harder. When he was 17, a car found a wall at 2 in the morning and failed to get back up. Adua stood in a living room, full of men in polo, shirts with flashlights and signatures, and asked how much. Behind that question was another, more important one. How much of this can money lift out of his life and drop into someone else's? Her sister Irene sat with a hand pressed to her chest. He needs help, she said. Not a new car, not a softer landing, help. He needs space to be young, Adua replied, as if youth were a country he'd been denied entry to. You raise your children your way. I'll raise mine. You're not raising him, Irene said. You're orbiting him. Then move out of my orbit, Adua said, but her sister did not move. She stayed. Through years of parties with music that shook, mirrors and years of gates that slid open for boys who had learned to tuck arrogance into their pockets like cigarettes. When Maya arrived, she did not look like a girl who would fit into those parties. She looked like what Zeno had stopped noticing: clean notebooks, a hand that smoothed stray hairs behind an ear, a pulse of work and hope. He liked the quietness of her and also the challenge of it. Some people chase chaos, others chase the stillness that resists them. He found the right shade of voice and the right angle of smile. She was far from foolish, but she was human, and he had a talent for making humanity feel like weakness. The day she told him she was pregnant, his face rearranged itself into disbelief so fast it looked like cruelty was a reflex. It's not mine, he said. Handle it. When she said she wouldn't, that her body wasn't a waste bin for his decisions, he laughed a bored, ugly laugh she felt for weeks after. She left with a dignity that trembled only when no one could see it. Chels, her friend said, if he won't listen, go to his mother. It sounded like faith in a system. Maya held on to that faith and walked to the gates. Uniformed men made of shoulders and instructions watched her plead and checked their watches and kept their palms against their belts. She left with her dignity intact and returned the next day, because hope often looks like stubbornness from the outside. On the third day, a sleek car swept up the drive, and Adesua's eyes moved over Maya. The way people scan weather forecasts. Will this be nothing? A bit of rain or a storm I need to plan for? Inside the house, Maya's small hands folded and unfolded in her lap. She told the truth like a person paying a bill, calmly, completely aware that there's no point paying part of it. Adesua listened with the stillness of a woman who had learned that stillness puts other people at a disadvantage. She allowed a full minute of silence afterward and then nodded to a small purse someone had placed on a glass table. Money arrived in the space between them like a verdict. I'm not asking for that, Maya said. That's exactly what you're asking for, Adesua replied. It's quicker to be honest about it. I'm asking for responsibility. Adesua's mouth curdled around the word. My son is not a ladder, she said. Find another way to climb. Security removed Maya gently because humiliation is easier to bear when it's gentle. The gate closed on the last thing she said. You'll regret this. Not because of me, because of him. After that, the house treated women at the gate as the weather. Sometimes a light drizzle, sometimes a downpour, always inconvenient. Adesua leaned into the narrative that kept her from sleeping. Badly, predators circled money. Some of those stories were true. The ones that weren't still helped her make decisions quickly. The morning a girl arrived, bleeding and shaking. The guards looked at each other and argued with their eyes about whether to let her in. They did. She told a version of a story that Adesua had already heard, and the familiarity of it numbed what pity could have done. If you were where you were supposed to be, Adesua said at last, this wouldn't have happened. The girl's face emptied out, as if a tide had gone out and left nothing behind. Security guided her away from the living room with professional compassion. Zeno floated above all this like a kite you can no longer see the string of. The following afternoon, officers returned with notepads and questions. Their voices were not yet the voices of people who knew exactly what had happened. They were the voices of people still building a case. Adesua answered like a CEO at a quarterly call, minimal, strategic, charming in exactly the portions needed. At the door, she asked how much more of this nonsense they expected to bring to her doorstep. Later that evening, she dialed a number she shouldn't have, and a voice she shouldn't have called told her that there were lines, and that she had dragged a toe over one of them earlier in the day. It wasn't the toe that mattered, it was the pattern. The arrest came the next morning with precision you could feel. The senior officer who took off her cap in the foyer and wiped rain off the brim didn't look around at the art. She looked at Adesua, the way a locksmith looks at a lock he has the right key for. "Where is he?" the officer asked. "Why are you speaking like that in my house?" Adesua asked. "It's not your house right now," the officer said, and someone swallowed a laugh that slid through the staff like a gasp. Voices rose. The son was located. His face blanched with a surprise that would have been comical if it weren't so pathetic. He tried 3 different personas in 30 seconds. Arrogant, bored, wounded, and none of them fit. Hands moved into handcuffs. Words were read out. Zeno searched his mother's face for a promise that had always worked before. Fix this. Her own promise had always been some variation of "I will." The word that rose now, unbidden and unwanted, was "can't." In the station, fluorescent light erased the glamour the world had painted on both of them. Adesua sat and a door opened, and Naomi walked in wearing a uniform that fit her like a decision. Time did something strange in that moment. Memory misfired. The past forgot to remain the past. "We've been documenting," Naomi said. "Not just this case. The habit, the threats, the offers. It's all here." She pressed a button. The room filled with Adesua's voice. "I'll make it worth your while." Name the number. The appalling normalcy of her tone, like a mother ordering fruit while also thinking about an email, made the recording worse than the words themselves. Adesua stared at the device as if she could will the red light into green, a stop into a go. "You don't understand," she said. "There are people who lie. There are people who seek opportunity and ruin. I've been protecting my son from the world." "From consequences," Naomi corrected gently. "You were protecting him from consequences. That's different." The court had bad acoustics and good light. The judge looked like someone who had learned to put heavy things down gently. The prosecution did not foam or gnash teeth. They laid out timelines and let the dates argue with each other. Women came forward one by one, their voices not always steady, but steady enough. The defense did their work and found every inconsistency that could be found and held those up as if tiny cracks could make a wall fall down. Then Naomi spoke and threaded stories into a single rope. Small, ugly things that had been brushed under rugs. Larger, uglier things that had been handled by men who shook hands in the dark. A habit of power flexing and expecting the air to lean out of its way. When the sentence was read, Zeno seemed less shocked by the number than by the fact of it. Adesua's own sentence landed with a dull thud in her chest. 10 years redistributed themselves in her imagination into 1,000 mornings of fluorescent light, 1,000 nights of the sound blankets make when they're folded by strangers. She did not weep. Pride, even broken, has habits. She lifted her chin too high and saw, too late, that there are angles that make you look more alone than you are. Prison was not cinematic. It was small sounds and large silences. It was the leveling of faces stripped of their meanings. It was learning to say please to women who had never cared what she wanted. It was the strange friendship of routine and the violence of stories told in whispers at 2 a.m. It was also eventually the soft, humiliating relief of being told what to do, when you no longer know how to move through a morning. Adesua's hair went gray in fast, uneven streaks. Her hands lost their jewelry and remembered their veins. She wrote letters to Zeno and returned to them with a pen and crossed out sentences that sounded like excuses and left only the brittle honesty. "I did this. I thought I was loving you. I was loving myself." He wrote back seldom at first, then more regularly, then in a voice that had learned unwillingly how to live inside decisions you can't edit. He did not ask her to save him. He asked what she was reading. He asked whether she had made a friend. He wrote finally, "I hate what I did more than I expected to." That is not a request for comfort. It is a fact. On the day of her release, the sky felt too open. The first deep breath outside the gate wobbled. She stood there with a plastic bag and a small pensioned dignity and realized she had nowhere to go that didn't echo. She walked to a bus stop because walking has a way of making the world make sense even when it doesn't. Irene opened a door and swallowed a gasp, and then swallowed her pride and pulled Adua into a hug in one smooth, efficient motion. The spare room swallowed Adesua's small bag and still felt empty. She pointed at the kettle, then remembered to ask permission. For a while, she lived like someone borrowing space from herself. She kept the room neat enough to apologize for its existence. The city had grown taller, as if to make her feel smaller. She moved through it like a rumor. People recognized her face and practiced kindness or cruelty, depending on the mood they'd woken in. Sometimes a shopkeeper held her change too long. Sometimes a child looked at her without understanding, which was the gentlest gaze she received all day. She took buses to the part of the city that felt the least like a city and stood in small parks with blackbirds and remembered her, hand on Naomi's cheek, and wanted to fold the scene into a paper boat and let it drown in a creek. Zeno came out with a walk that suggested he was still learning to gauge the distance between himself and other people. Irene said his name first, quickly, as if it would hurt less if it hit the air fast. He hugged his mother without drama. His face had changed, but his eyes had learned stillness from somewhere. "I'm sorry," he said, which felt like a line that should have been in a film, but wasn't. "You should have stopped me." "I should have," she said. "I didn't." He applied for jobs and watched doors close with the patient astonishment of a man who already expected them to close, but hoped they might misunderstand and open anyway. One afternoon, he didn't come home until dark and apologized to Irene for the worry without explaining himself. The next day, he held a paper in his hand as if it might fly away. "Cleaning work," he said. "Night shift. Big building that smells like lemon." He started that night. The glass doors breathed open for him without judging the clothes he wore. He learned which floors complained when the mop moved in certain directions and which security guards told long stories because they liked to practice kindness on strangers. He saved small money. He slept hard. He began to own something he hadn't felt since childhood, the sense that tomorrow would not be exactly like yesterday, and that this might be good. Up on one of the top floors, there was a hallway with a portrait that had been hung too high. The lighting made the person in the portrait look taller than life. Zeno noticed the painting the way you notice a smell at first and then can't stop smelling it. The first night he glanced at it and felt a twitch in his chest that wasn't familiarity. Exactly, but something kin to it. He kept walking. The second night he looked longer and told himself it was because the frame was crooked. The third night, he set the bucket down carefully before he let himself look. The woman in the portrait wore a suit that had been tailored by someone who knew that power looks better when it doesn't try. Her expression was not the expression of a wolf. It was the expression of someone who had been hungry and remembered it vividly and built a life where hunger would have to wander the city for hours before it could even find her address. The young man standing beside her, hand in his pocket, eyes steady, wore a small smile that looked like a secret he didn't intend to tell anyone. The plaque said nothing except a name he couldn't read from that angle. The mop fell. The clatter snapped the hallway out of whatever spell it had wrapped around itself. He picked up the mop and tried to put his breath back where it belonged. It didn't quite fit. On his lunch break, he went to the small courtyard, where a bitter plant tried to be a garden and a bench had been painted. Too many times he sat. He stared at his hands, which were dirty in a way rich hands never are. He ate a sandwich slowly. He had learned, in the last few years, how to talk to himself in a voice that did not blame or excuse. That voice said, "Keep your head down. Do your work. Don't go looking for history where it could find you first." He kept his head down. He did his work. He walked past the portrait like a man walking past a dog he didn't know, slow, respectful, aware of teeth. The building did its breathing, people in the morning, people out in the evening. Zeno learned the pattern. What he didn't learn was the name on the plaque. He didn't stand that close. The person whose face lived in the portrait did not patrol the hall at night. She walked those floors during the day, when the building smelled like coffee and printers. She had a way of saying good morning that made people answer better than they intended to. She had a way of standing by the window that made employees feel that windows had been placed in buildings for a reason beyond light.